plane landed under a moonless sky, no call signs, no clearance, no warning. At precisely 3:20 a.m., a military transport jet bearing no national insignia touched down at Ouagadougou International Airport. A handful of airport staff, startled and silenced, watched as men in black uniforms rolled open the cargo bay. Out came nearly 300 people, shackled, silent, and stripped of identity. No passports, no documentation, no explanations. When a Burkinabe officer stepped forward in confusion, an American agent smirked and said, "They're yours now." For months, whispers had surfaced about a secret deportation pact that Donald Trump, newly returned to the Oval Office, had authorized a covert Operation Exodus, using forced migration as a geopolitical weapon to destabilize regimes unwilling to comply with Washington's demands. Now, the whispers had a flight number, and Burkina Faso, independent, defiant, and led by Ibrahim Traore, had just been chosen as America's dumping ground. What the architects of the plan didn't foresee was the explosion. Within 72 hours, footage from the airport would go viral. The world would learn, and a continent would rise. Because this time, they didn't just move people, they crossed a line. It wasn't a document meant to be seen, but once it leaked, it could never be unseen. A digital envelope tagged only Exodus Phase 1 began circulating in underground journalist circles. Within it, a series of internal memos, ice flight manifests, and a confidential directive from the Oval Office marked "Top Secret, Presidential Action Required." The letterhead bore the unmistakable signature, Donald J. Trump. The contents were chilling. Commence immediate offloading of stateless and untraceables to pre-cleared partner nations. Burkina Faso, listed as priority drop site, deploy with minimal media risk. This is not a negotiation, this is leverage. Leverage. That was the word, not diplomacy, not aid, not alliance. Leverage of human lives, of vulnerability, of chaos. The memo outlined an aggressive timeline, 20 flights within 60 days. Targeted individuals were described as non-returnables, those without provable nationality or whose countries of origin refused repatriation. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Dump them where the state was strong enough to absorb, but isolated enough to stay silent. Burkina Faso, under Traore, was not silent. Hours after the manifest leaked, the Burkinabe Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a firm statement. "Our nation did not authorize these landings. We do not recognize these transfers. Burkina Faso is not a storage facility for failed empires." Meanwhile, images surfaced, men and women confined in wire-fenced hangars near the airport, guarded by foreign security personnel, contracted privately, paid anonymously. Among them were pregnant mothers, elderly men, even a teenager with a diabetic condition. None had legal representation, none had heard of Burkina Faso before arriving, and none knew why they had been chosen. The leak ignited headlines across Africa. Trump deports without borders. Burkina Faso becomes America's migrant dumping ground. Leverage or crime. International law experts began dissecting the legality. Human rights advocates called it geostrategic trafficking. The African Union requested an emergency briefing from the Burkinabe government inside Washington. Damage control began. Press Secretary Karen Dalton denied knowledge of any such program. President Trump has always prioritized border security. Any flights conducted are within legal bounds and in partnership with vetted allies. But she couldn't explain why no official records existed, or why the only paper trail was signed in the president's own hand. The storm had begun, but it wasn't just political, it was moral. The silence didn't last long. By the following morning, President Ibrahim Traore stood before a hastily arranged press conference in Ouagadougou. Behind him were images projected on a giant screen, satellite footage of the landing, time-stamped manifests, and a close-up of the signature, Donald J. Trump. His words were sharp, unflinching. "We are a sovereign people. We may be poor, but we will never be a pit where empires offload their human consequence." The room erupted, not in applause, but in realization. Across the continent, the leak turned into a reckoning. In Dakar, civil society groups organized vigils outside U.S. Embassy, holding placards, reading, "Humans are not leverage." In Lagos, lawyers petitioned the African Court on Human and People's Rights to investigate possible violations of international law. In Accra, students staged symbolic, stateless marches, walking in silence without ID cards. Blindfolded, but nowhere was the fury more intense than in Burkina Faso itself. Local communities mobilized to support the newly arrived migrants, even as resources stretched thin. Imams and priests issued joint statements demanding dignity and due process. Traditional leaders condemned the United States in rare, unified language. You have violated more than a border. You have insulted a people. Meanwhile, a second leak emerged. This time, internal ICE training documents for Operation Exodus. One page included psychological assessments advising deportation officers to maintain emotional distance by referring to detainees as units. Another page included a map of West Africa. Burkina Faso was highlighted in red. Below it, the phrase, expendable but contained. The insult was global. Within 48 hours, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees issued a statement expressing grave concern over the forced displacement of individuals to countries with no legal obligation to receive them. Amnesty International called the operation a premeditated human dump, and then came the breaking point. A video, secretly recorded inside one of the holding zones, showed a young man barely 20 whispering to the camera, "I was born in the Bronx. I don't even speak French. My country doesn't want me. And now this one doesn't either." The footage ended with a question, "Where do I belong?" That one sentence, raw, human, unfiltered, spread across social media faster than any leak. And in that moment, the crisis stopped being about policy. It became a crisis of belonging, of borders, of dignity. Bamako had never hosted a summit like this. Inside the marble halls of the African Economic Sovereignty AES headquarters, 54 flags hung in silence. Every seat was filled from ministers of state to tribal elders, from legal scholars to frontline organizers. A single chair, however, stood empty. The chair marked United States. Observer. They were invited. They declined. Cameras flashed. As Ibrahim Traore stepped to the podium, he wore no military uniform, no medals, only a black tunic embroidered with the phrase, "Dignité, pas deported." He didn't open with pleasantries. He opened with proof. Behind him, a wall-sized screen lit up not with maps, not with graphs, but with the voice of Donald Trump. "You want to play sovereign? Let's see how Traore handles 10,000 bodies dropped on his doorstep." The room froze. The audio had been extracted from a White House Situation Room recording leaked by an anonymous whistleblower. Though distorted and partially redacted, the voice was unmistakably Trump's. "Use the chaos. Use the migrants. If he wants to fight the dollar, let's see if he can feed the stateless." Shock turned to fury. Representatives from Nigeria, Senegal, and Ghana stood in unison. The chair of the AES Assembly pounded the gavel not to silence, but to summon order before the explosion. Traore leaned forward. "They used our gold, they used our oil, now they use our people. But hear this, Burkina Faso will not break. Not for your migrants, not for your threats, and not for your lies." A storm of applause swept through the hall, raw, defiant. Outside, thousands watched the speech on projection screens in the public square. In cities across Africa, crowds erupted. The hashtag, "We are not your trash," trended globally within hours. But this wasn't just digital rage. It became mobilization. Civil aviation unions across West Africa announced a coordinated strike. No plane linked to Operation Exodus would be allowed to land, refuel, or pass through regional airspace. In South Africa, lawyers prepared a motion to bring the Trump administration before the International Criminal Court under charges of human dumping. And in New York, a growing number of African American groups issued statements of solidarity. "We were once cargo, now they try to make us cargo again." The backlash went beyond borders and far beyond Burkina Faso. In London, protesters gathered outside the US Embassy, hoisting signs that read, "Migration is not a weapon, and Africa is not your consequence." In Paris, a group of African students chained themselves to the gates of the National Assembly, reciting the names of deportees lost in transit. And in Chicago, a mural emerged overnight, painted across a brick wall in the South Side. A black silhouette, kneeling, a plane overhead, and bold words, "Deported like dust, returned with fire." Donald Trump did not remain silent. At a rally in Arizona, he leaned into the outrage, turning it into fuel. "They want to cry about human rights. I say this, no papers, no country, no return. Fine. Let them deal with Burkina Faso. Let them learn responsibility." The crowd roared. The clip went viral. But this time, it didn't dominate the narrative. Instead, it sharpened it. Traore, in response, called for a second press briefing this time, with representatives from every deported individual's community, tribe, or region. It was symbolic. It was precise. Standing on a stone platform outside the Ouagadougou parliament, Traore declared, "We have not just received your people, we have received your disrespect. You think you can weaponize the displaced? We turn every wound into witness, he announced the creation of a Continental Refugee Dignity Fund, crowd-funded across the AES bloc, to support the deportees' resettlement, not as victims, but as full residents with rights. Burkina Faso also filed an official complaint to the United Nations Human Rights Council, citing violations of the 1951 Refugee Convention, UN Charter, Article 2 Sovereignty, and Article 9, Forced Population Transfer. But the boldest move came next. Traore proposed the foundation of a new court, the International Tribunal for Migration Justice (ITMJ), a judicial body to try any state using forced migration as geopolitical leverage. Shockwaves hit Washington. Suddenly, this was no longer just about a leak or a flight manifest. It was about setting precedent and challenging a system built on impunity. Across the diaspora, the story shifted. For generations, Africa had been cast as the origin point of displacement slaves, refugees, migrants. Now, it was becoming the voice of return. The first wall wasn't built with bricks. It was built with law. Within 72 hours of Traore's announcement, the National Assembly of Burkina Faso passed an emergency resolution, the Sovereign Migration Defense Act, a sweeping legislative shield that made it illegal for any foreign nation to deposit, offload, or redirect migrants onto Burkinabe soil without an explicit bilateral treaty ratified by Parliament. The penalty: immediate expulsion of all personnel involved, seizure of aircraft, and criminal prosecution under national security laws. The AES bloc followed suit. One by one, nations from Mali to Guinea, from Chad to Benin, enacted similar statutes, effectively closing a quarter of the continent to unauthorized migrant dumping. It was the first coordinated legal firewall against migration imperialism. But Traore wasn't done. He ordered a full audit of all non-governmental organizations operating near airport zones, refugee processing centers, and foreign-funded humanitarian clinics. What they found shook the country. Multiple Western contractors operating under development or logistics licenses had received direct funding from U.S. defense intermediaries. Their real task: preparing the logistical groundwork for Operation Exodus flights. Documents recovered included shipping invoices for prefab detention units, water ration schedules for temporary population inflow, and biometric gear, sourced from private security firms linked to former CIA contractors. Worse yet, a private aviation company registered in Florida had filed repeated flight plans using the call sign Medevac, masking deportation charters as medical supply runs. The deception was surgical, and the intent was undeniable. In a nationally televised address, Traore stood beside the Minister of Justice and the Chief of Intelligence as they revealed the findings. This was not a mistake. This was not confusion. This was an act of strategic infiltration aimed at turning our land into your logistical landfill. The revelation catalyzed a wave of arrests. Contractors fled. Foreign NGO offices were sealed. Bank accounts frozen. Court summons issued. In Washington, pressure mounted. Congressional Democrats called for hearings. Progressive media likened the program to covert rendition for the undocumented. Trump, meanwhile, remained defiant. They want walls. Build them. Just don't expect us to care where we dump the trash. But across Africa, a different wall was rising. Not made of concrete, not designed to keep people out, but a wall of will to protect the dignity of those forced to cross borders, not by choice, but by coercion. The ripple became a wave. In Addis Ababa, the African Union convened an emergency session. For the first time in decades, every head of state from the continent attended in person. The agenda was clear, and the sentiment unified. Forced migration as political leverage would not be tolerated. The AU issued a historic declaration: no African soil shall be used as a burial ground for the failed policies of foreign powers. They unanimously voted to support the establishment of the International Tribunal for Migration Justice, ITMJ, proposed by Traore, and pledged initial funding, legal personnel, and diplomatic recognition. Outside the chambers, African youth flooded the streets holding signs: "We are not leverage. We are people. No soil for sale, no soul for trade." The movement began to reach beyond Africa. In Geneva, human rights lawyers from Latin America and Southeast Asia expressed solidarity. Many had faced similar dumping operations under past administrations. Brazil, Indonesia, and even Mexico offered to co-sponsor the ITMJ. In the U.S., dissent grew. Whistleblowers from ICE began leaking internal memos detailing mounting confusion and moral conflict within the ranks. One memo revealed a scathing internal review: Operation Exodus lacks legal coherence, violates international norms, and places field agents at risk of war crime accusations. At a protest in Washington, D.C., African American leaders spoke from the steps of Howard University. We are descendants of those who were displaced, and we will not stay silent as others are displaced again. Trump, ever defiant, tweeted, "The left wants open borders. I want smart ones. If Burkina Faso can't handle a few planes, they don't belong in the grown-up world." But his bravado rang hollow. State Department officials scrambled to manage the diplomatic fallout. Several African embassies in Washington recalled their envoys. Visa restrictions were imposed on certain American officials. African trade ministers began informal talks of forming a bloc to review U.S. trade agreements with countries complicit in forced migration. And yet, amid the geopolitical drama, something deeper had changed. Burkina Faso, long written off as a peripheral state, had become the center of a moral revolution, not just about sovereignty, but about the sanctity of movement, of humanity.